final part of English Literature Paper 2 is the unseen poetry section. So this is section C that we're going to be walking through now. For this section, there will be 2 poems that you've not seen before, and they will be linked by theme. Themes that we've had before include cats, the month of May, weather, shopping, childhood. So there's a real diverse thematic link that we might get. For this section, I want you to think about my top tip. So I think for some of you, the biggest problem is this kind of sense of panic. You're seeing a poem for the first time. In your head, you think it's going to be very complicated and that you're going to need to identify lots of things that you might not know about. The first tip that I've got is don't panic. You've worked with unseen texts before. Don't focus on the fact they're poems. Think about what are the main ideas, what is the poet trying to say, and what do I understand about this poem? The poems will be connected by theme, but that doesn't mean that they'll have similar ideas or attitudes, and that's okay. In a way, it's even better if they're not similar because it's going to give you more to talk about. The poetic techniques are ideal if you can quickly identify them, but don't panic if you can't. Talk about the ideas, the imagery, the word choices. Think about all of the ways that we've taught you to tackle an unseen piece of text. For this walkthrough and for the Easter revision that we've set for you, the 2 poems tackle the idea of growing older. Poem 1 is called Warning and poem 2 is called Pushing 40. And then you've got some bullet points. So it suggests that you should compare the ideas in the poems, the poet's use of language and the poet's use of form and structure. And it reminds you that you need to use evidence from the poems to support your comparison. This section is 20 marks again, the same as Jekyll and Hyde Part A, Jekyll and Hyde Part B, and your conflict poetry. So each part of this paper is worth 20 marks, so each part of the paper is worth 25%. One of the common mistakes that people make in the exam is they forget that this question is there, and it's 25% of the marks. So you do need to remember that you've got to do your unseen. Even if you don't have very many ideas, even if you're running out of time, you need to be able to write something, else you are stopping yourself gaining the maximum amount of marks on this paper. When this is all added together, the total paper is worth 80 marks. First thing we're going to do is we are going to read the poem number 1, Warning. It is actually one of my favourite poems, so I was really pleased when this one came up because there's so much that you can talk about. So let's read it. When I am an old woman, I shall wear purple, with a red hat which doesn't go and doesn't suit me. And I shall spend my pension on brandy and summer gloves and satin sandals and say, we've got no money for butter. I shall sit down on the pavement when I'm tired and gobble up samples in shops and press alarm bells and run my stick along the public railings and make up for the sobriety of my youth. I shall go out in my slippers in the rain and pick flowers in other people's gardens and learn to spit. You can wear terrible shirts and grow more fat and eat 3 pounds of sausages at a go. Or only bread and pickle for a week and hoard pens and pencils and beer mats and things in boxes. But now we must have clothes that keep us dry and pay our rent and not swear in the street and set a good example for the children. We must have our friends to dinner and read the papers. But maybe I ought to practice a little now, so people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I'm old and start to wear purple. So as I've been reading this, one of the things that are going through my head are kind of the key ideas and the main things that I might want to talk about. So initially, the poem is about the speaker looking forward to growing older and being in a position to rebel against stereotypical expectations and behaviour for an elderly person. It moves from simple ideas such as wearing colours that clash to the more shocking behaviour when she says that she'll engage in antisocial activities such as sitting on the pavement and gobbling up samples and running her stick along the public railings, to going out in her slippers, picking flowers from people's gardens and learning to spit. So things that we might not really think about when we're getting old, but perhaps some of those things that we know are inappropriate. The speaker seems desperate to enjoy life. She wants to make up for the sobriety of her youth. That means kind of holding back from those indulgences and those luxuries, a little bit like we saw with Utterson, if you remember in Jekyll and Hyde, where he talks about how he drinks gin to mortify a taste for vintages. So following those kind of social expectations. And then there's this kind of suggestion that a reader can join in with the wearing terrible shirts or eating whatever's wanted and being able to hoard things. So kind of bringing in the audience there. And then the penultimate stanza, the second to last stanza, considers how for the time being that when we're younger, we kind of have to conform to these expectations and confines. The poem ends, however, with the speaker deciding to enjoy life more, that she wants to practice a little bit more, so that this kind of threatened character change doesn't shock people when she actually gets there. The second poem then is called Pushing 40, and it goes like this. Just before winter, we see the trees show their true colours. The mad yellow of chestnuts, two maples like blood sisters, the orange beech braver than lipstick. Pushing 40, we vow that when the time comes, rather than wither, ladylike and white, we will henna our hair like Colette. We too will be gold and red and go out in a last wild blaze. So this more modern poem is much shorter than the first poem. So that's going to be a little bit more tricky because there is just less to talk about in it. However, the title, Pushing 40, suggests the speaker is nearing the age of 40, which is terribly old, I'm sure, and is pondering that when growing older, she'll not wither ladylike, but will go out in a wild blaze. She talks about just before winter, and we know from literature that the seasons are often used to describe the seasons of your kind of life. So spring is birth and renewal, sort of usually hope and connected to dawn. We've then got summer, which is sort of the best time of your life when I think it's vibrant and green. We move into autumn, where we've got the gorgeous colours, but things are beginning to fade, beginning to die. And then winter really is that kind of that period of death where things is too cold to flourish. So the winter being kind of the end of life. And so this poem connects this idea of autumn and getting older together. And I think this poem really, for me, when I was reading it, it's about kind of refusing to grow old without fighting it, and suggests that she and her friend or sister are both determined to challenge old age. So like the speaker of the first poem, they want to be rebellious and they want to have colour in their lives. And that really kind of stands out from both poems. This idea of defiance about old age and what old age should be. We don't want to be the little frail old ladies with the Zimmer frames. We want to have, you know, coloured hair and wear purple hats and red or orange lipstick, and we want to be these kind of larger than life people without the confines of our youth, and kind of fight those stereotypes of what we consider getting older might be like. So whilst there's a number of ways that you can approach this unseen comparison, you know that one of the things that I'm going to talk to you about is going to be EDAC. It's something which we've taught you because a lot of you struggle in terms of getting started, and in the classroom we might give you sentence stems, or we might give you ways that you can approach talking about these poems. EDAC gives you that sense of confidence in knowing how to open each of your paragraphs. So it doesn't matter whether it's about Jekyll and Hyde, Macbeth, your unseen texts in your language papers, or whether it's about poetry. We know that we can follow the same format of this kind of established, developed, amplified, concluded, and that's going to allow you to talk about these poems in detail. So beginning with how the ideas are established, both poems establish their ideas through the semantic field of colour. In Warning, one of the things that she talks about is, when I'm an old woman, I shall wear purple with a red hat, which doesn't go. So this sense of bright, bold colours that we might not traditionally associate with older people. And in Pushing 40, the trees show their colours, the mad yellow of chestnuts, two maples like blood sisters, the orange beech. So the yellow and the orange and the red of the blood there, perhaps maybe suggesting fire. So the connotations of those colours with being fiery, with being kind of energy and light. So really kind of fighting against those more muted tones that perhaps society expects from older people. So the way that getting older is established is through that semantic field of colour initially in both poems. What's interesting in the way that the poems develop is this kind of use of modal verbs, particularly in Warning. So she says, I shall sit down on the pavement and gobble up samples and run my stick along the public railings. I shall go out in my slippers and pick flowers and learn to spit. So this repetitive structure coupled with the modal verbs there, are really working to show this tone of defiance. She shall, the degree of certainty there, I mean, I will sit down on the pavement, and kind of again this defying what is expected of somebody who gets older. And similarly in Pushing 40, we have this idea of we vow that when the time comes. So this sense of kind of inevitability, that you can't stop getting old, like that's going to happen no matter what you do. However, you can choose how you tackle that. And so the modal verbs and this idea of vowing that we see in both poems show that idea of the poets fighting against the social expectations of getting old, and that this reluctance to fade into the background just because they are aging. And the modal verbs are continued as the poem amplifies this idea of like these kind of restrictions that we feel in our youth, and how actually they don't have to remain and they can be lifted as they get older. The modal verb must, and we follow that same structure in Warning. We must have clothes, and we must have friends. So this sense of we must, showing the restrictions that we have as we are younger, because they are the things that are expected of us. So we have to have clothes that keep us dry, and we have to pay our rent, and we have to not swear because we've got to set a good example. So all of these things, as I've said before, like we see in Utterson, in Jekyll and Hyde, like this feeling of this is how we have to behave, and this sense of this is the situation for the poet or the speaker in Warning, the fact that they have to comply to these expectations. However, this kind of sense of when those restrictions are lifted, that they don't have to have clothes that keep us dry, they don't have to set a good example. And in Pushing 40, she talks about how we will henna our hair. So perhaps the social expectation is that we grow old with grace, so we let our hair go grey. But why do we have to do that? So in Pushing 40, she says we will. So there's that sense of inevitability that runs through. So both of the poems amplifying this idea of lifting those restrictions, and the fact that actually being young is a burden, and as we get older we can fight back, and we can not continue to conform to these kind of expectations of what aging should or must look like. So lastly then, thinking about how the poems complete, how they finish, both end with this idea of breaking those stereotypes of being old, and both poems link back to their opening. So in Warning, she says, but maybe I ought to practice a little now, so people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I'm old and start to wear purple. So echoing that, when I'm an old woman I shall wear purple, when suddenly I'm old and start to wear purple, that lovely cyclical narrative there, beginning and ending with this sense of defying those expectations. And the same, although perhaps a little bit more subtly, in Pushing 40, she talks about we'll be gold and red and go out in a last wild blaze. And so I mentioned when we talked about Establish this idea of fire, perhaps, and how that is about this sense of kind of defiance and energy. We see that in the last wild blaze, the word blaze there linking to the idea of fire, and the gold and the red, so the gold and the yellow, the red and the blood. So we've got that cyclical link back to the start with this sense of we can defy those expectations, that these are the expectations that we have. However, the semantic field of colour in Pushing 40 links back to that opening with the motif of fire, and the colour of purple in Warning, talking about how she doesn't have to wear muted pastel tones, that if she wants to wear a hideous red hat that clashes with her purple clothes, who is anybody to say that she couldn't or shouldn't do that? So both poems ending really with this kind of lovely cyclical narrative where it goes full circle and comes back to that opening image. So both poems really looking at, in different ways, defying expectations, fighting against what growing old or aging should or must look like, and how we can shed those kind of social expectations and behave in ways that perhaps are inappropriate but actually are quite freeing and quite liberating. So what's really interesting is, although both poems use very different methods, they both have this idea of growing old is something that you must rage against, you must fight against, and that there's no shame in that. So the last things for me before you have a go at writing this, It doesn't matter what you say something. One of the biggest things that I see in the exams when I'm marking these is people who've just not attempted this question, whether it's because they found it tricky or they forgot that it was there. This is a 20-mark question, and saying something is better than saying nothing. So in a sense, it doesn't matter what you say, you will pick up marks for talking about the ideas in the poems. Don't overly panic about techniques. Again, it's ideal if you can recognise them and use them, but don't make empty comments about rhyming schemes. So, you know, poem one's got an A-B rhyming scheme, whereas poem two doesn't, or, you know, poem one's got rhyming couplets, whereas poem two's written iambic pentameter. They're empty comments that are not going to pick you up any marks. You might want to talk about a regular rhyme scheme, which is used to emphasize or amplify something, but don't just write that they're there. That's like pointing at a car engine and going, that's an engine. It doesn't actually tell us anything about how it works, which is where you're going to pick up your marks. Again, don't overly worry about the similarities. A lot of times when I see people responding to this question, they're like, oh, poem one does this, whereas poem two doesn't. Poem two does this, whereas poem one doesn't. Try not to worry too much about those. If you focus on the ideas and how they're established, developed, amplified, and concluded, and then link where you can, that's going to pick you up more marks than just saying poem one does this, whereas poem two doesn't. That's not going to pick you up those marks that you're going to need to get into those top grades. Spend around 30 minutes writing. Try and write as much as you do for each of the other sections. It is worth 25%, so you're looking at the same amount of marks for this as you do for Jekyll and Hyde Part A, Jekyll and Hyde Part B, and your anthology conflict poetry essay question, which is section B. So do try and spend 30 minutes writing there. Apart from that, good luck, and hopefully I will look forward to reading some of your responses.